Today, we're delighted to have Alex Edds, Director of Innovation at JLL. Alex advises both JLL leadership and its clients on the technological and systemic disruption facing the property industry. Hi, Alex. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. And on a tropical island.
Good. And so today, I know you're going to talk about how can commercial buildings adapt to a post-COVID-19 world. So without further ado, over to you, Alex.
Thanks very much. First technical challenge, I'm going to try and share my screen. So hopefully this comes across, assuming everyone can see that. So hi everyone, good afternoon, or good afternoon to those of you who are listening in Europe. As Matthew just said, I'm Director of Innovation here at JLL in the UK, and I wanted to talk about, for the next sort of 15-20 minutes, just a kind of response to what we're seeing here in the market, and also sort of learnings that we've gathered from our colleagues around the world as a consequence of this crisis, and specifically talk about the response by the landlord or investor manager community. There's been a lot of talk around the impact on the economy, a lot of talk around the impact on the individual corporates or the markets that are going to get hit, and therefore the occupier community. But not that much talked about the response by the landlord community. So that's what I want to focus on today. And obviously, given the context of this event, talk specifically about how I think tech and innovation can sort of support that. So that's what I'm proposing to talk through. And as we said, I'd be happy to take questions as we go, or at the end we can have a bit of a Q&A. I think the first thing to say, which is probably fairly self-explanatory, but I think that particularly in a role like mine in innovation, innovation often is seen as something which is easier to do when times are good and there's additional monies perhaps to be spent to trial and test new ideas. But actually, and I think history tells us this, that it's during times of crisis or times of hardship where we have to adapt very quickly, that often sparks and catalyzes new trends and new ideas. And I think definitely some of the things that we're all having to do now, and indeed and particularly within the context of real estate, to deliver and continue to deliver services and businesses and operate, some of those trends clearly I think will stick with us way beyond the end of this crisis. What I'm going to do is just run through, and to be honest, I'm going to run through quite quickly. I've pulled some slides together which pull on some of the research that we've done here at JLL, plus some of the insights that we've gathered. Trying to get to the end as quickly as I can to talk quite specifically and tangibly about some things that I think we should all be looking to do. But roughly, talk through what we know, and I think most of you read, you'll see the news, you know what's going on. I'll sort of give a bit of an insight into how and what we're seeing here at JLL. The impacts and implications of that on the market and on our client base, and obviously what we think is going to happen next. So in terms of what we know, I don't need to tell everyone how challenging this has been and how challenging it continues to be. I suppose the sort of summary of this slide is the market particularly has been impacted in different ways at different times. So depending on where you are globally, clearly from east to west, the impact has been different. And also in terms of the markets that have been, or the sectors of the economy that have been hit. So clearly some sectors have actually done quite well, whereas others have obviously had, and are continuing to have a really tough time. And depending on how governments are reacting and or how and where you are, where the country is in its cycle, sort of gives rise to when we think these challenges and when the stages of recovery are going to happen. But clearly there's a massive liquidity challenge within the real estate market particularly. And when we look to the particular areas of disruption around usage of space, clearly that's where a lot of the focus and attention is amongst particularly the landowners, landlords, managers, around how do we continue to operate as best we can, both during this and then obviously as we come out of it. Kind of pretty obvious sort of slide, but I think useful just to kind of articulate some of the challenges around the real estate sector specifically. Clearly, in terms of the way that we're creating new product, there's been, clearly a massive halt and stoppage to that. Buildings that are still being used either by key workers or, where they have to be used, clearly that there's a challenge there about how we continue to operate them, but then also mothball facilities that are not being used, and obviously a lot of, particularly in the office market, workers working from home, and how does that sort of build and support, the need for physical space or otherwise. And then, most clearly the sort of value challenges or given the challenges of many occupiers, how landlords are dealing with, their tenancies and the value at risk there. I'm obviously going to focus more today on sort of where and what we think we should be looking to do as we come out of this crisis. But I think it's just useful in terms of understanding what we've been through and understanding, obviously how some of our clients and some of the sectors have been hit harder than others. In terms of what we're seeing, and I'm going to sort of pull sort of very heavily on colleagues from Asia, and particularly in China. I don't know whether anyone else has seen this report, but we've put together a report here, particularly in China, but also just anecdotally, some of the conversations that I've had with my colleagues. We're already, I mean, this is a few weeks old now, so the China particularly and other Asian countries are sort of already into their recovery, and actually we're seeing quite a lot of activity, particularly in the office market. I mean, certain sectors did pretty okay and or thrived during the crisis, and actually coming out of it are now looking for new space and indeed to grow, which is quite interesting. And I think a key point there, which is sort of coming through loud and clear, is that actually for those spaces that are being looked at, there's an increased interest in quality of space. Quality being, in inverted commas, what does that mean? But I think specifically around buildings and landlords that provide amenity, service, and indeed security and safety in the current times. So a premium on quality of service, I think, is fair to say. Clearly, retail slightly slower, but we are now seeing a recovery in that sector, and malls are open, people are shopping, and I think in terms of those that did okay during the crisis, and quite an odd one in terms of perhaps counter to pre-crisis trends, that actually local community shops did pretty well, and actually looking to sort of bounce off the back of that and grow opportunities, particularly online. Logistics, fair to say, did pretty well and continue to be resilient and grow off the back of it, whereas obviously hospitality hit very hard and probably be most likely to be the slowest to recover. But in sort of picking away and sort of trying to understand, particularly across all of those sectors, what are the landlords or the occupiers looking for, and I just want to pull out a couple of highlights because relevant, I think, to this audience. But again, no surprise probably, but what we're seeing, particularly in mainland China, is an interest in how landlords can seek to offer safe and secure buildings, particularly through sort of screening, and we're seeing a demand for things like thermal imaging cameras come into building reception halls, also sort of touchless access controls, whether that be security gates or elevators, and then the ability to remote monitor and actually remote manage buildings as well. And on the occupier side, a great interest in and a huge demand for occupancy analytics, so sensors and workplace sensors and wayfinding and all of that. So there's sort of, I guess, some of the sort of specific technologies that we're seeing a lot of interest for. If we look, I guess, at what the implications are for the market, this is a slide which we use here at JLL, particularly within our corporate business, to kind of help our corporate clients navigate this. And I'll just show it up really to kind of articulate the journey of loosely respond, re-entry, and reimagine. So as clients come through or companies come through the crisis and then look to adapt and re-enter the marketplace and or take back into their spaces, how are they going to do that? What are the programs and policies they need to put in place? How are they going to re-engage their employees? And then sort of thinking slightly longer term, what do we imagine and reimagine the spaces that we need, and how would we use them? So quite a useful framework, and one that I'm going to borrow as we go through. Pretty obviously, in terms of the short term, clearly business critical has been order of the day. I'm not going to major on this at all, but clearly in terms of how businesses have had to react. But longer term, I think what's interesting is some of the questions that we're seeing come through in the discussions we're having with our corporate clients is, how to rethink their spaces and the importance of, what they're placing on the spaces and how they use them. And clearly this then gives rise to, well, how are the buildings adapting, and what is the landlord or the investor offering? What we'll see evolve and I think grow on the left is a greater interest in things like wellness. It was already an accelerating area anyway, but I think one that's seemingly has already seen signs of acceleration, and indeed a number of clients looking to things like wellness agendas, but also air quality sensors and all that goes with that. Clearly around agile working, flexible working, looking for hub spoke model rather than particularly relying on one floor plate, and then looking through to what technologies they might use, and very much supporting what was already there, but I think continue will be the corporate social responsibility and being seen to be doing the right thing in this time. Whereas on the flip side, clearly things that are going to be more challenging and/or we're going to see a reduction in is around how they manage their lease terms, and not only from a financial perspective but a flexibility perspective, thinking about what they need, where they need it, and how their people are going to use it. And clearly that has massive implications on the floor plates that they need. So we're going to see a greater drive for, and indeed we already are, and I just list some of them here from a technological perspective. Some of the technologies that we're already seeing being demanded, and indeed being asked for within buildings. I think there are some questions here, particularly around some of the, and in fact I had a call this morning around the use of thermal imaging scanning in Europe, given we have GDPR regulations here. It's been quite a common, or indeed it's a highly demand in Asia, but whether or not we'll see that emerge here, I don't know. But these are some of the things that we're seeing demanded by our corporate clients, and indeed mix that with some of the products and services and the materials, particularly for what they can see to be, providing a healthy and safe workspace for their employees. So I guess my message here to anyone listening who has products or services in this area, there is a growing area of interest for this. There is a demand for this. Clearly, timing and budgets associated will be challenging in the short term. But if it can be proven to support the strategy of re-entry, then clearly I think will be something that continues to grow. I thought I would just share, this is the first time that anyone's seen this publicly, but I thought I would just share our own, JLL's own re-entry. So we're an employer here in the UK. We've got a number of offices across the UK. And just as a summary, really, but just to give you an idea, really, I guess, of what some of the corporates out there, and we're a corporate of employees, clearly where and what we're prioritizing. And I suppose the summary of this is that we're looking to have between 10 and 20% of our workforce, coming back into the office once lockdown is lifted. But there will be an elongated period of time where, a vast majority of our staff are still working from home. So clearly, in terms of prioritization and engagement with our landlords, it's been quite interesting in terms of how some of them have been quite proactive and come to us with plans and are working with us on those plans, and others less so. And I think that probably gives rise to what I'm going to talk about now, which is how can our office managers, particularly in the office sector, and I appreciate that most commercial real estate portfolios will have a diverse set of sectors. Most will be exposed to all sectors. So for the purposes of time and brevity, I can only really focus on one sector. So I've picked the office sector. So, a context being that this is not fully comprehensive. But I just want to do, and I'm not going to go through every slide. I've broken my own rule here by putting more than three bullet points on a slide. So apologies for that, but I thought just useful because you'll see in terms of the strategy from re-entry of, sort of 3 to 6 months period, what the priorities are for owners and managers of buildings at a portfolio level. So strategically at a portfolio level, what are we thinking about? What are the considerations that we need to be taking into account? And how do we then implement that both now, but then also how do we sort of move to a reimagine phase? So what might the longer term trends be? And you can see, and I think just picking out a couple of those, communication, absolutely vital. I think that's something that's been traditionally quite poor between landlord and tenant. And I think that this is if only going to accelerate and I suppose bring landlord tenant closer together. Because if you're not speaking to your tenant about what they want and what their re-entry requirements are, then you're pretty far behind. And I think data, so understanding new sources of data, maybe data that you already had but you haven't really been looking at, will be essential for you to manage which buildings are going to be brought back online, when, how they're being used, So, analytics around both real-time data, but also perhaps, existing financial lease data that you might already have. And then more tactically, but still, I guess, from a strategic perspective, but looking at the specific assets. So again, from a re-entry perspective, looking at how you're engaging with your occupier, particularly what technology changes are needed within that building, training, thinking about the people that are running the buildings and the people that are on site, and how they're going to be able to cope with and respond to this during the next sort of 3 to 12 months. And obviously, the requirement for cleaning and other, necessities is going to increase. So that's going to have an impact on service charge budgets, which might well mean that other things get missed out. And then again, thinking about where we might move to in terms of reimagining the spaces. I've sort of touched on some of these, but just to pick out a couple, I think looking at new facilities management standards and strategies. So looking more towards remote workflow, automation ready, and sort of responsive FM will be something that's been sort of, if you like, had to be learnt overnight by some. I think that will be a standard that continues. Whether or not new standards of quality come in, there's been talk of a new standard of cleaning, for example, and whether that will be something that we'll still see emerge. And again, if I haven't said it once, I'll say it again, communication. I think that will be absolutely vital, both in the here and now, and indeed as we go forward, is to understand how are my buildings being used, what do the occupiers actually want, how are they using it, and how can I adapt? So these are more the strategic considerations, and they sort of pull on conversations that I'm having now, conversations that I'm hearing from through my colleagues with various clients, and indeed some of the things that we've pulled together as what we think are important, both now and in the future. And if I just then drop down into some of the more tactical considerations, and again, apologies, I know this is a very busy slide. It comes from some work that we've been doing internally. And again, I'm not going to go through it all, but I thought just useful for you all to see, I guess, the complexity and the expanse of things that need to be considered, whether you're managing or owning. And again, this is focused on offices. So, clearly the whole operation of the building and thinking about how we can operate the building, continue to operate it, and whether or not we can reduce down the costs and operating costs. That's obviously been quite critical during the re-entry phase. Communicating with tenants I talked about, I think mapping, understanding the customer and actually understanding how they move through the building, how many people are using the building and what their needs are. Clearly the provision of certain services will be affected, and whether that has to be done remotely or particularly with less resources, putting in place physical structures around social distancing. Clearly a huge focus on safety and security. We talked about some of this earlier. I think there are question marks over what technologies can be used, but clearly around access control, touchless entry and things like that, I think will be highly demanded. And then, some of the trends that we saw, but I think, particularly around well-being, air quality sensors, air quality analytics, maybe even air quality enhancements, provision of, certain types of cleaning standards. And we talked about that here. And I think aligning that with some sophisticated data around footfall to understand, where areas need response quicker. So I think, my point here is that there's an awful lot of things that landlords should and could be thinking about. And indeed, many of our landlords already are. I guess the key point to this group is technology and data supports most of this. So again, if you're out there with a product or service in this space, then really thinking about how it can support the strategy, particularly around re-entry, which is the most immediate concern for most between now, over the next sort of 12 months. Then clearly understanding how that value or your value proposition aligns with that re-entry strategy is important, and I think will be highly in demand. If I just move to reimagine, which is, I guess, the sort of longer term sort of thinking around, well, what trends and what trends are we likely to see, off the back of this, sort of 12 months plus. And again, I'm not going to go through it all, but you can kind of see where we see interest from some of our clients. Some things were there already around things like sustainability and well-being, but actually the acceleration of that, and even things like climate change and energy savings, perhaps not directly related to this, but I think the they sort of combine into what is, I guess, landlord of choice or responsible landlord, and kind of be seen within the same vein. So actually, I think, continue to be a lot of pressure on buildings to perform and be delivered to a high standard, both in design and operation, which I think is quite key and quite a key differentiator. And then, around, as I said, ongoing heightened awareness around from this pandemic, but also I think in terms of cleanliness, access, and the need and the provision of certain services to support that, and particularly around the provision of digital services, something that, again, we've already started to see emerge in the market. But again, this has sort of given rise to, and I think that need. And one thing which I suppose and I hope continues is the engagement between the landlord and the tenant community. Only really by active engagement are either party going to have a successful re-entry and then reimagination of their space, and particularly around data. And I think that will be quite an interesting conversation as we go through this, is what data is being gathered either on the staff themselves or the way that the buildings are being used, and how the landlord might use that, and counter how the landlord might provide information and data back to its tenants to inform workplace decisions. And again, technology data drives pretty much most of this, so this should be kind of music to the ears of any prop tech people on the call. So really, just in summary, from a re-entry perspective, which I guess is sort of between now and sort of 12 months, depending on where you are, the priority for landlords and owners is as it is here, communication is key. Looking to get their buildings ready to be automatable or at least remote monitoring. Health well-being hasn't gone away and is going to accelerate, particularly around indoor air quality. Operational efficiency is really high on the agenda. A lot of our time, particularly on our property management side, is helping clients bring buildings down to base loads and understanding how they can provide maximum efficiency in the way that they're being run. Real-time analytics, both at the asset level, so understanding how the building's being used, but also at a portfolio level, and then the ability to adapt those spaces more flexibly. And I think one that hopefully again sort of sticks with us is this occupancy and journey mapping. So really understanding your customer better, understanding how they're using the spaces and what they want will be vital and should be very much the ingredients for your strategy. And as we move forward, thinking about some of the longer term trends, some of them sort of play through, but smart building kit systems properly integrated, I think that's really important, and something that we've seen already with some of our landlords is the challenge that where there's not integration, so actually how they're being integrated properly, and then through to some of the new models that might emerge from this as we go forward. But just finally, my last slide, my last point really is you can make the safest, most sustainable, most healthy building you want, but people have still got to get there. And I think really this is sort of almost a bit of a caveat to everything that I've said, which is clearly it depends where your building is and who's going to be occupying it as to how demanded it is, and that only comes through communication. So communication vital to understand who and how your building is going to be used is important. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to, I know I rattled through that, but I'll stop there and pause for questions. I can't actually.
Well, no, thank you very much, Alex. Very, very interesting indeed. Got a couple of people asking if it's possible to receive the presentation afterwards. That would be good by the sounds of it. But also, I've got a question here regarding the technology. What sorts of platform solutions would be the most important? I have heard the access control already. Anything else? Thank you.
Okay, well, look, let me just, because I know I flipped through this quite quickly. So I think, here is an attempt to try and provide some of those specifics. I think you're right. I mean, access control clearly is something, and we're already seeing quite a lot of interest for that from our client base. And that extends beyond security gates, that potentially also into, lift and elevators and other spaces. So basically anywhere where there's, people are having to touch surfaces. And I think also around automation of efficiency and around building systems. We've already had to deploy, and in fact, a lot of our FM guys and girls have had to sort of learn new skills overnight to help our clients, manage their sites remotely. So the use of some of the smart building systems to help support that, I think, will be vital. And then lastly, around indoor air quality, I think the rise of that will. In fact, I've already read a number of articles and seen a number of press around, you know, how buildings perhaps don't make us sick, or not, the indoor air quality is not as good as the outdoor air quality. Again, I think this will only just give rise to that awareness.
Sure. Well, there's quite a few questions that are coming in, so we might not be able to get through all of them, but I'll start with this one here. Thank you for this presentation, which covers practically all our real estate subjects. Interested in the slides as well. Do you think we are living the end of open spaces in office buildings?
I said to myself, you know, one of the things I didn't want to do is to be another person trying to crystal ball gaze what the future might be. I guess difficult when the title of this presentation, I can't really get away with it. But look, I think, you know, and from no other source than myself, I think, you know, why do I want to go into the office? And I think, if anything, this period of time has taught me is what the value of my office is. And the value of my office is certainly not going in, sitting down at a desk with a laptop or a screen and writing a report. The value of my office is going in, meeting colleagues, collaborating, coming up with ideas. And some of that is formulaic and you know, happens in meetings, and others it happens, you know, in the corridor or on the stairs or in the cafe. So for me, I think one of the things that this will teach us, albeit, you know, it's quite difficult to qualify this, is actually the value of our office spaces are where we collaborate, because we're social creatures and we need to do that. And indeed, businesses thrive off that. So if anything, I can see, you know, the use of space being turned more towards that than indeed, you know, bums on seats. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's definitely my take on it.
No, absolutely. Thank you. And we've got another one here. Do you think this crisis will break through some of the barriers previously seen to the implementation of innovation? I.e., will the client demand trigger the need for landlords, developers to provide more innovative building environments where there previously wasn't per se a business case?
Yeah, and look, this is music. Director of Innovation, so anything that can help innovation is great. I think, look, it goes back to my first slide, right? I think when times are good, sometimes, you know, you get budgets and you have time and effort to spend on things, but actually often there isn't a pressing need. And so getting people's attention and actually adapting people's, you know, if it ain't break, don't fix it. So there's tends to be a sort of resistance to change. I think when we have something like this, there's a need to change, and, you know, overnight everyone's become expert at Zoom or MS Teams. And I think, you know, the same goes for, you know, some of the things I've talked about, where there is a demand for and where there is a need to deliver a certain outcome, whether that is, you know, a safe, you know, screening process, whether that is, you know, an access control system, whether that is smart building system. If the landlord thinks and believes that to be the solution that they need to install, then absolutely, I think that you'll see an acceleration of interest. I suppose I would just, you know, play back to the prop tech community on the call, is that it's important to really be clear about the value proposition that you're offering and how your product or service will actually help solutionize that challenge, because they're going to have very specific challenges to meet and budgets are going to be tight, but they absolutely will want to respond to deliver, you know, buildings and products that their occupiers want. So aligning those two is critical. Okay, excellent. Well, we just got one final question here, I think, here. Yeah, so what is the feedback from commercial real estate investors regarding understanding human behavioural change in their facilities? They were more focused on having smart building tech, but now it shows that it is more important to understand how people are using those properties. Yeah, it's a good question, and it's correct observation. I think, look, it's probably too early to tell, as we're, you know, most buildings still standing empty, right? So it's too early to tell perhaps how it will evolve. What I guess I can reflect on is definitely the conversations that we're having with our landlords is they want to know more about what our corporate clients are doing. So JLL has a corporate business and an investor developer business, and indeed our investors are very keen to understand, well, how are our corporate clients, you know, re-entering the business, re-entering the workplace, because that will help inform them as to what they should do. And I think that where that goes, if you sort of follow that through, is, back to my point before around communication, engagement, and indeed the landlord and the tenant coming together much more closely. And I think we're not far away. In fact, it probably already exists, where data is being shared between the two parties, and they have kind of mutually supportive strategies where that data and that engagement is necessary to deliver. And I think you don't have to pick out one, for example, would be around the achievement of, for example, climate change goals. So the only way that we're going to achieve, for example, net zero carbon, if you're a corporate occupying a floor versus a landlord owning a building but only having responsibility for the common parts, is to know the sum of the whole. And the only way you're going to do that is if you share data. And I think as one example of how engagement is going to be necessary and data sharing is going to be necessary. And I think smart building tech as a sort of general term, as long as it's architected in the right way and has the right privacy around it, and serves both parties, I think will only help.
Excellent. Well, I think that's really interesting presentation. Thanks very much for your time, Alex. Much appreciated for preparing that and obviously presenting it right now. Very much appreciated. I think there's a bank holiday in France tomorrow, so we won't be having a daily talk tomorrow, but we will be reconvening on Monday with our next session, I believe. So in the meantime, stay safe, everybody. Thank you once again, Alex, for your time. And we'll see you again soon at another daily talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.